Welcome to the Corrales Arts Center's March 2021 Salon. Our topic is the culinary history of the Rio Grande and Corrales, and our guest is cookbook author and Corrales resident, Jane Butel. And I'm Kathleen McCleary, and I'm coming to you once again via Zoom. You guys have all done this quite a few times, and you're used to it. And I hope you're all doing well during this coronavirus pandemic. History buffs and foodies, you are in for a treat today. Get ready to learn something new and to whet your appetite. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, Charlene Spiegel of Corrales, for generously making today's presentation possible. Now, about Jane, she's the authority on Southwestern cuisine, and some credit her with starting the craze for Mexican-American food. Her first cookbook was published in 1966, and she's written a total of 32 of them. That's more than I could fit on this one screen. And she's run cooking schools here in New Mexico, as well as other places. And they've won awards, Best in the US from Bon Appetit magazine and Gallo.com. Jane can show you an easy way to make ribs or tamales or cornbread and much, much more. You can find out more about her classes and her recipes on her website, janebutelcooking.com. And in case you don't have the right ingredients on hand, you might be able to get them from her Pecos Valley Spice Company. But I want you to know that Jane hasn't always been a chef and an educator. She actually, in a previous life, had expertise in consumer affairs and marketing for Consolidated Edison in New York and for GE Hotpoint and American Express. Now I'm going to stop this screen share for just a minute and give you a little bit more on Jane. She's a familiar face, I know, to many of you. You've seen her on local television or perhaps at the state fair or even at events here in Corrales. But I want you to know that she's actually known around the world. And we just got some evidence of that, a poem that Jane received just yesterday from a woman in the Netherlands who took one of Jane's classes 25 years ago. The woman's name is Nelleke van Lindonk. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But here's what she wrote as a toast to Jane on International Women's Day. The smell of the fajitas sizzling, music of heat and skillet marrying, drip of cheddar cheese bubbling out tortilla folds, bite of jalapeno ring on my anxious tongue. Enchilada sauce warms my belly with song, each taste and smell richer than the next. But my favorite flavor by far is Jane Butel, the queen of Tex-Mex. And if that wasn't enough, what makes Jane's classes unique is that she actually provides the history of the foods as she cooks. For example, did you ever wonder which pueblo grew the blue corn that you're using? Well, Jane can tell you. So I want to turn it over to Jane, and I want to ask her to start at the very beginning to tell us about the origins of this Southwestern cuisine that we've all come to love. So Jane, take it away.
Thank you, Kathleen. I really appreciate your very generous welcome. I love to tell this story. It's the history of how culinary actually started in all of the Americas. Almost everyone seems to agree that that the earliest times, probably during the Ice Age, the first culinary in the Americas started with migrations coming from Mongolia and Tibet. The first settlements were probably right here in the Rio Grande Valley. And of course, way back, the Rio Grande used to be like an inland sea. And you know, the escarpment up by where the university is and where we go up to Rio Rancho, those of you that are familiar with the terrain around here, those were early banks of the river. And 2nd Street was the bottom of the river. So they found that they had arable land, and what they did is they developed this culinary with just what was available. The earliest ones that went further south into Mexico developed corn, And then there was chili. So let me tell you the 10 food groups that actually emanated from the Americas and have gone around the world. The first is the nightshades. And did you know that nightshades are called nightshades because they ripen at night? Did you know that tomatoes don't ripen during the day? So if you want to get your tomatoes good and ripe, put them in a dark place. Also, other nightshades that are very popular in the cuisine, in addition to the chilies are a nightshade, so are tomatoes and potatoes. And you might say those are really diverse, but what makes them of the same file or the same family is the style of the blossom. It also includes petunias and nicotiana, which is tobacco. Of course, chilies, there's been arguments for decades on whether they're habit forming or whether they're addictive. Of course, we know that tobacco is addictive, but chilies are not. So anyhow, we'll go on from there. The three nightshades, the tomatoes, potatoes, and chilies. And then the next is the trilogy, which are the sustenance of the cuisine. And the main stock of the corn was how they would, what the Indians called stooling. They would create a sort of a circular tilled bed with some organic material with the, the everlasting circle. And in the center, they put organic matter and plant the corn. Then out from the corn would come the legumes, which could be anything from beans, all kinds of beans. And then coming out from that would be the gourds, and that could be anything from zucchini to watermelon to whatever. And so now we have the sustenance of the cuisine, so to speak, because so much of the cuisine was endured for thousands of years without any added meats of much of any kind. Then next come the flavorings, and the two most common flavorings are the wild onions and the wild garlic. And did you know they grow throughout all of the Americas? And then the favorite herb is called Yerba Buena. And do you know what the Yerba Buena is? It's the Spanish call it Yerba Buena. It's mint. And mint can be everything from peppermint to spearmint to catnip, and of course, Mexican oregano and so on. And that captures the less than 10 food groups that really sustained and developed this culinary culture. In fact, so many of the recipes that we enjoy today were developed hundreds of years ago. Then the two foods that kind of are the most unique or really important in the cuisine are corn and chilies. And so I'm going to dwell on corn first. Corn actually started in a transit, if you did a trajectory from Mexico City to Atlanta. It's just north and east of Mexico City where the first corn was developed. And just a few years back, they found tiled fields in central and northern China that were exactly the same as they are in Mexico. So that shows the back and forth. There's a lot of things that show the back and forth, and I'll be telling you that as I go along. That one of the things that I think is totally amazing, I just heard this relatively recently, that some culinary historians said that our world population would be 84% less if the corn had not been developed. Isn't that interesting? Because corn will grow almost in the rockiest of soils to the swamps, and corn does feed the world. And I think corn is much maligned. I think various marketing agendas have kind of put corn down, but corn's really healthy. And did you know that blue corn is the only food known to woman and man, I like to say it like that, that is 100% nutrition. That's how the ancients endured. They say that the Anasazi's probably 99.9% of their diet was blue corn. So corn started in Mexico, and when they were developing the corn and whatever, the ancients had, they really believed in numerology. And numerology, as it relates to growing crops, is every 7 years you have a great crop. Well, if 90% of your diet was corn, you'd be highly motivated to try to find a way to keep it, especially if you're in a soggy climate like some of the southern parts of Mexico where things can get mildewed or whatever. So they found when they buried the corn or took the corn to the coral caves down in the Isthmus of Mexico that the corn kept well. Well, you know what coral is? It's lime, it's in limestone. So they found that, you know, it's very impractical to carry the corn all the way down there. So then they found, oh, even to this day, when you go to the markets, the major markets throughout Mexico, you'll find little plastic bags of ground lime. The ground lime doesn't only preserve the corn, that's actually how you make pozole. And from the pozole, you grind it, and that's how you get masa. And from masa, you get tamales and tortillas and tostadas and just all kinds of other things. Then, and another thing that limestone is good for is that's their Teflon. In fact, if you go to their kitchens, you'll a lot of times see these gorgeous kitchens, but they don't cook in them because they get too messy because they use little bamboo brushes to brush the limestone slurry onto their griddles when they cook. So moving right along, the white corn was always the color of corn. Of course, it's like white limestone on white corn is perfect, but white limestone on darker corn, well, wait a minute, I'm telling it in reverse. The darker corns evolved, and here you can see an evolutionary, aboriginal kind of corn. See how it has the white mingled with the blue and different colors? Well, as the darker kernels developed, that was the highly prized corn of the north. And northern Mexico and New Mexico is where blue corn evolved. And what's different about blue corn and all other corns is blue corn has lysine. It's one of the essential amino acids. If you don't have enough lysine, you'll get fever blisters. So that explains that one. And just to show you a bit of the difference, these are kernels of pozole. And pozole is the mother process of preserving the corn, and we make stews out of it, and then we also grind it. And I want to show you the difference in the kernels. I don't know whether you can see it from where you are, but here's a kernel of white corn, and here's one of blue corn. And the white corn has a much smaller endosperm or oil content. The blue corn has a big one. And see, this is so hard. It's very difficult to grind blue corn and much easier to grind. White corn can be ground with lava wheels. This has to be ground with steel burrs. And the reason that blue corn is so aboriginal is that the 19 pueblos in New Mexico are where the blue corn has actually been cultivated and inspired and developed for thousands of years. And each of the 19 pueblos has their own strain of blue corn. And it's only one of the pueblos that's willing to sell seed corn, and that is the San Juan Pueblo. I found that out when I did a national press release on blue corn for my spice business years ago. So with the importance of corn down in Old Mexico and the Pueblo Indians here, they deified corn. The corn goddess is the only female goddess of their whole culture. And if you think about it, the silks are the male part and the female part's the silk. So to make an ear of corn or to make a kernel of corn, the pollen has to drop down, travel with the silk, and create every single individual kernel. So that's kind of the fascination, I think, of corn. One of my directors, when I had the TV show, the PBS show, said he even thought that was so convincing. He said, maybe I am started out as a vegetable. So the other ingredient that I'm going to dwell on a bit more is chili. Chilies evolved in the Americas just as corn did. And chilies they went over to Asia, as you probably have maybe thought about it or didn't even think about it. But you don't see chilies in ethnic foods from Europe. They're just not much there except for maybe Great Britain or English cooking because they had the influence of India because that was one of their colonies. So I think as we grow older, sometimes health and nutrition become a little more interesting. I know when I was young, I thought nutrition was one of the most boring courses I ever took. But now the older I get, the more fascinating I get with nutrition, especially learning more about chilies. But first of all, let's kind of dwell on the basics of chilies. First of all, chilies can have up to 15,000 variation of heat units on one plant at one time. That's why when you buy pods of chili, whether it's the dried red ones or the fresh green ones, I'm going to show you a little tip that if you have, I always had cousins from Boston that couldn't handle anything hot. So for those, we would buy these mild chilies. And what makes a mild chili is broad shoulders. See how broad the shoulders? And a blunt tip. And the lighter coloration. Now, these don't have that much lighter coloration. But if you want the hotter ones, now these could have been on the same plant at the same moment. See how if they have a narrower shoulder and a more pointed tip, they're hotter. So the narrower the shoulder, the more pointy the tip, the hotter. So that a lot of people argue with me all the time about wanting to cook with pods. I say, well, yeah, but you never know what you're getting. Whereas if you cook with powders, and if you get from a known source, such as myself, they're all graded to have a consistent flavor. But moving right along, green chilies are highly perishable. They don't last very long. And if you're buying green chilies, and they're very difficult to get in the store. I'm doing a week-long class starting Monday. I had to go to 2 stores to get them, and I have to go back again tomorrow. Chilies, they just don't stock many of them, and I guess they sell out pretty fast. If you want to get a fresh chili, look for the greener the stem, the more freshly it's been picked, or more recently, and the shinier the skin. See how it's sort of shiny? Those are fresher, and they're easier to work with. Now, how do you preserve green chili? Because if it's so perishable, I better do something with it. It can be dried, but hardly anybody does that. The easiest way is to freeze them. And I don't know if you can see this real well, but these came out of my freezer. And the best way to do it, I think, is, and it's also the easiest way, is I like to use the grill outside. And during the summertime, we grill a lot. So just take a bucket of cold water with some ice in it, and you grill the chilies until they get a uniform kind of brownness, and then plunge them into ice water to stop the cooking. And then drain them and put them on cookie sheets and freeze them. And then you can have a bag of chilies. If you want one chili, like in our family, I'm the one that really likes chili. So I like chili on my scrambled eggs. I like chili all day long. And some of the people that, company and people I live with don't like chili so much. So that's what's so easy about freezing them one at a time, rather than peeling them all and chopping them all. Also, when I chop them and to put them in a dish, I cut them 1/2 inch widthwise, and I don't chop them. That way they know, hey, she made it herself. Also, green chilies, not only are they highly perishable, they're very high percentage of vitamin C. And then a very interesting thing takes place when it becomes fall. You know how the deciduous trees like oaks and maples, the leaves go from green to beautiful shades of oranges and yellows and reds and so on. Well, when the coloration of the chili, when the green goes away, and on the same plant, this will happen. You don't grow red chili plants and green chili plants. It's all on the same plant. It's a seasonal variation. But the vitamin C just kind of goes tippy-toeing out, and vitamin A becomes very, very prominent. And you know what's interesting about that? It sort of makes you believe in a creator up there, because vitamin A is the vitamin we need during the wintertime when the days are shorter and the nights are longer, because it's an eyesight vitamin. Another thing that's really interesting is when I first started the business decades ago, the chili business and cooking and whatever. When I first started the chili business, I was fascinated to know there were 7,010 varieties of chilies. Well, now there's probably hundreds of thousands. The craze has been for hotter and hotter and hotter still. And some of the chilies are actually, they can call anaphylactic shock. And now back to the health of chilies. Don't be put back, if you're a woman, by someone saying, oh, you're such a sissy, you can't handle hot chili. Well, you may be one of the super sensitive tasters. There was a sense of taste study done a couple of decades ago by 3 women medical doctors in the New York Metroplex. And the bottom line of their study was that women can have up to 200 palate receptors that can detect spicy heat, and men can have as few as 10. So the guys with 10 receptors can taste it really hot because they're not getting much of the heat. But us women that are very sensitive. So anyhow, if you can eat at least a half a teaspoon, I keep this on my table at all times. This is the Caribe chili, which is 15,000 heat units. And I have these little spoons. This is from Oaxaca. This one's silver from the Navajos. And this is Pekin, the fairy godmother of all chilies. And it's 40,000 heat units. Well, if you just take, just a half teaspoon, 2/3 of the time, the incidence of ever having cancer or heart disease is out of the window. That's kind of good to know, isn't it? And it's pretty easy. In addition to the health aspects, chilies help you to have the waistline of your dreams because of the endorphin reaction. Chilies make your cells in your body get excited. And when they get excited, they burn energy and that makes you weigh less. Then the other thing is they help your complexion. If you have trouble with outbreaks in your skin, eat more chili. Also, chilies aid digestion. I've had people really argue with me, especially when I was back east for so long, and I would give a lot of demonstrations and classes, and they tell me that my food tasted sharp. And I said, no, that's the taste of chilies. And they would, they just couldn't handle it. They said, well, I can't handle spicy food. I have digestive trouble. And I said, well, you know what? Your digestive trouble might just be gone because chilies cauterize ulcers. Huh, that's interesting. It also a lot of times cures diverticulitis. So it's because chilies aid gut action and they aid digestion. Not all chilies are created equally, especially not all chili powders. Chili powder itself was developed by a German for the Confederate Army marching out of Texas. They were so long on beef, and that's a whole other story. It's because of San Antonio and the whole fight for independence, for the Texas independence. But anyhow, so the standard formula for chili powder is 40% chili, 40% salt, and 20% additives, flavorings, and preservatives. But if you buy pure chili, and not even all pure chilies are that pure, and I'm just a little blowing on my own horn, but I make sure that we don't have silicates and we don't have diethylene oxides. Most commercial brands do because the diethylene oxides keep the red color red and the silicates keep it from lumping. But I say lumpy chili is a good thing. And then when you buy any chili powders or if you buy the pods, try to keep them as cool as possible, preferably the refrigerator or the freezer. A lot of people ask me questions. Well, how long is this going to last if I buy a whole pound from you? I say it'll last as long as you have it, as long as you keep it in glass. Glass is much better than plastic because plastic breathes. I think it's really interesting to kind of learn how long ago chilies became very, very popular and very revered. I don't know that they were deified like corn, but in ancient Egypt, in fact, if you go and visit in the museums there or even the Louvre in Paris, you'll see little chilies buried alongside the mummies for the afterlife. And you can also see that in the Natural History Museum in New York. And then more fascinating, of course, chilies went first to China and from over the Bering Strait and all that. In Mongolia and the Sichuan and the Hunan areas in the Gobi Desert, they were impossible to police because they were nomadic and there weren't too many of them. So they didn't worry about them, just let them do their thing. But in mainland China, which was pretty heavily populated, chilies were not allowed, listen to this, not allowed to be eaten as food. They were too precious. They had to be reserved as a pharmaceutical clear until about 1950 or 60, whenever Mao Zedong, the communists, take over. Isn't that interesting? I find it totally interesting. And you can go to the ancient apothecaries. I had the pleasure or displeasure of going into China right when it first opened up in 78. And I wanted to see a birthing hospital. And there in the pharmaceutical area where they get their medications, were chilies, all covered with cobwebs. But, you know, that's just the way it was. That's what they had, mushrooms, and they believe in a lot of unusual cures. Another really interesting thing about red chilies is that red chilies have the greatest ability to prevent oxidation, and oxidation is spoilage. And after the Spanish came, and the Spanish brought the three most important ingredients they brought were large animals, which are the hogs. They also brought chickens, wheat, and sugar. And of course, the wheat and sugar have kind of really damaged the diet of the Native Americans. They have a lot of diabetic issues with them because their system, it doesn't digest them as well. But at any rate, about 1540, when the Spanish started coming up from Mexico, and they were the Spanish came because of the Inquisition in Spain. In Spain, the king and the queen made a declaration that if you wanted to continue living in Spain, you had to become Catholic. Well, a lot of the native people in the Valencia and Seville areas, the southwest portion of Spain, sorry about that, had come over from the Middle East, and they were of Jewish background, and they weren't too excited about being Catholic. When they went through the gates of Venice, through the Grand Canal, there were X number, I think somebody told me 150 different toll stations. So each one of those big castles exacted a toll. So that was why it's so expensive to get ginger from China and all the other spices from Indonesia and so on. So anyhow, several of the men decided they'd just as soon go on those voyages and settle somewhere else rather than stay in Spain and become Catholic. So they came over, and there were several different voyages. And after a few of them, the men that settled decided, hey, we want some women. And there's a whole bunch of diary entries in some of the libraries about women that were highly disappointed because the men, to convince them to come, told them that the streets would be paved with gold and there were gas street lights, and it was just glorious over there. You just won't believe what it's like. So the women came and found out there was dirt and more dirt and not too exciting. So that's how the flour tortilla started. The Spanish blooded women they didn't like to eat corn. They thought corn was animal food, or it just wasn't something they were used to. So they started using wheat, and that's how the wheat tortilla started. So there were about 5 generations later, approximately 5 generations later, interestingly enough, the clergy, the Catholic clergy, approached the King of Spain and said, you know what, we'd like to go over to the New World and build churches and see if we couldn't convince those people to become Catholic 100 years later. And lo and behold, the crown said, yes, we'll do that. And there was one caveat, and the caveat was this, that they had to serve a Spanish wine. And Spanish wine, coming from the port of Barcelona to the port of Veracruz, and then by ox cart clear up into New Mexico, took 6 to 8 years, and it was vinegar. So the clergy whispered back, they said, couriers, like, bring cuttings. And you know what, which is really interesting, I think, interesting little bit of history, that the wine industry developed so flourishing in New Mexico. The Perea family was one of the most prominent. They sold their wines from coast to coast, and wines from New Mexico were a bigger industry than California or New York or anywhere else until Prohibition. But being the land of mañana, we haven't quite got it together again. But then there are several interesting aspects about the building of the Catholic churches. They built them in each of the villages and in the pueblos. And so many of the Spanish women felt that, you know what, if the Indians and the Native Americans hadn't been so good to us and taught us how to cook and eat and survive in their lifestyle, we wouldn't have been able to survive. So they wanted to, I guess you call it, proselytize the Native Americans to come. And in so doing, they would make something of their culture every Sunday. And that's how a lot of the dishes began. Bizcochitos for one, but the most prominently known one, I think, here in Albuquerque is the Sopapilla. And the Sopapilla was developed, and I love this entry. It's in an old diary that I found. A Spanish woman wrote to record the first history of the Sopapilla. And it went like this: on one warm, balmy Sunday afternoon in April of 1620, we made these fried breads that we knew from Spain, but we made them slightly differently. We used lard, we fried them in lard and so on. And we called them Sopaipillas or Sopapillas, whichever way you like to say it. So they emanated from the Old Town Catholic Church in Albuquerque. That was where they were first made, right out in front of the church on that warm, balmy April Sunday afternoon. Isn't that fun to know? And the first settlers, when they were settling in New Mexico, they were told that they would be very well rewarded, and they were. They were rewarded huge land grants. In fact, if you go to buy property in some of the villages and areas in northern New Mexico, between the land grants and the water rights, I know from experience, it's difficult. And so anyhow, they were given these big land grants, and that was like from the 1540s on. So many generations later, and having Catholic families and large families, and splitting it up between 10 and 15 kids times whatever. Each one of them has a little bit of land, but they still are being honored. And I think it's interesting to know that when they were establishing the clergy in New Mexico and in the Rio Grande Valley and in New Mexico, Corrales became the headquarters, and that's why it's called Corrales, because that was the corrals where they kept their cattle, where they developed the wine, the vineyards, and apricot and apple orchards were very huge here. And that the clergy is actually given a lot of credit for sophisticating the cuisine. They brought spices like cloves and cinnamon and a variety of other things that they were used to in Europe, and then they shared them with the people that would come to church. So that was another impetus to come to church. And I'd like to, I know you, I can just go on and on about all the different kinds of things. I would like to just kind of share with you a little bit what keeps me busy. I have written 32 books. My latest one is Simply Southwestern, and my sort of, well, I'm really proud of it. It backed my PBS series for 8 years, and Publishers Weekly called it the Bible of Southwestern Cooking. It's the Southwestern Kitchen. And my prettiest book that has glorious photography is Real Women Eat Chilies. I always say there's a book behind every book, and this book was written to be the hotter than hell diet book. But my literary agent was also a lawyer, and about that time, the Atkins diet was getting a lot of legal flack, and so he said, you better change the title. So we still sell a limited amount of, my company at one time was fairly large, but the market changed, and I had bad investors. So we just have a few, mostly ingredients for Southwestern cooking. And I still teach cooking. And I teach right here in this kitchen. I used to have 3 hotel cooking schools, but as you can obviously tell, as I've gotten older, I just decided I'll pull it back, and I can hold 12 in my kitchen. And I'd really like to welcome your questions, and I hope I'll know the answers. If I don't, I'll find them.
Well, Jane, you have given us so much to chew on and lots to think about, and fascinating history. I really appreciate all that. And you're absolutely right. It's time for questions and comments. I hope our audience will start writing them into the chat function, or even coming on screen and showing your face, and I'll recognize you and tell you to unmute, and you can ask Jane your question. I certainly have a few of them. Hi, Sandy Farley. Do you have questions yet?
I do. One of the questions I had, she mentioned your classes, Jane. How often do you do your classes, and how do we find your classes?
Oh, thank you for asking me. I appreciate that. My website is open 24/7, and it's my name. It's www.janebutelcooking.com. With the COVID, I've really, had a tailspin, but we've started teaching again, and we just have a simple little calendar. I used to be real glossy and have everything, you know, but I'm sort of small now, but our classes honestly sell out a lot. We have weekend classes. We still have a few spaces left in our week-long class, which is starting Monday, and it's on sale 20% off. Then we have weekends, and we have the Oaxaca Culinary Tour, which is in June. But you can see all this. You can register online. You can also chat. You can also ask me questions. And I also have my phone number listed. So
I see another question. Sandy Farley, you want to come back on and ask that one? That looks like one that I was thinking about as well.
Right. We got a question from Doug who said, which of your cookbooks are best for basic Southwest concoctions and dishes?
Right. I was thinking the same thing, Jane. If somebody's wanted somewhere to start, you know, like if I don't have a good Southwestern cookbook, what's the best one?
Either the Southwestern Kitchen, which came out in the 90s, or what really put me on the map and has an amazing history as a book is the Tex-Mex Cookbook. It came out in the fall of '79, and it stayed in hardbound for 15 years. That's unheard of for a cookbook. And it was just put in paperback in the early 2000s, and it was just recently republished. So either one. The Southwestern Kitchen's a little more contemporary. They have some duplication, but there's a lot of differences in them. A lot of people that knew me when I first started my career teaching Southwestern cooking for a public service company for 10 years, I wrote the Cuisine de New Mexico, and that was expanded into Tex-Mex. So a lot of people want the Cuisine de New Mexico, and if you want it, the Tex-Mex book is it. Thank you.
Sounds great. 15 years is a long, long time for a cookbook, any book to be out there. Sandy, another one?
Yes, we got a question from Nancy Sturmer. She was asking, can you share the history of the use of chocolate in Mexican cuisine? I love that question. I was wondering the same thing too.
Chocolate? Oh, I love that story. In fact, one of our most popular classes is chocolate and chili, the marriage of chocolate and chili. Chocolate was developed by the Aztecs, and the word for chocolate in the Aztec language means bitter water. And chocolate was originally roasted and ground and mixed with hot water, and still that's the way they make their hot chocolate. They don't make it with milk down there. And it was a man's drink. And to temper the bitterness of the chocolate, they would add cinnamon if they had it, because you know the real good cinnamon until really recently, till the Vietnam War, till just recent, the best cinnamon comes from southern China, and it's the thin bark of a special pine tree. And it has a sweet, sort of a cinnamony kind of, well, it's obviously cinnamony, but a chili type taste. So that sort of bears out the Bering Strait issue, because they did have cinnamon way back, and they mix it with their hot chocolate. If they didn't have that, they'd put in chili. So, and then it spread from there. And in the older parts of Mexico and all that, one of my favorites is Oaxaca. I used to do tours to the colonial cities as well, but I was fortunate as a child to grow up with an uncle who was in charge of a huge cooperative program with the Mexican government. He was a veterinarian to get rid of hoof and mouth disease, and they lived in Mexico City and Oaxaca. So I got to live there I've been there since I was 8 years old, and I just totally adore it. Well, in Oaxaca, they have a little mill where you can go and grind your chocolate like every 3 or 4 blocks. And in the Tehuantitlan, which is a village outside, they have the same, you can grind your corn to make masa. There are public grinders available. Does that help answer your question?
That was a fascinating one, and I love Oaxaca too. It's such a wonderful place. I have a question for you. You mentioned sopapillas, and a key ingredient is lard. And this is an ingredient that a lot of us think, oh no, we better not eat lard.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I love to tell this story. It's a little wordy, but a very close friend of mine was a food editor of the Los Angeles Times. And periodically she'd call me or write me and say, Jane, she had to put out 3 syndicated stories to 85 newspapers a week. And so that takes a lot of, creativity. And one time she called, and just the day before, the home economist with Morel Lard had called me, and they said, "We heard you know how to make things with lard." And I just about fell over, because I grew up on a Kansas farm where we had 5-gallon buckets of lard in the cellar at all times. Well, so I told her, I said, "Why don't you do do a story on lard, on how good it is and the best properties and blah, blah, blah." So when she brought it out, this is the best part. She wrote, it was in railroad type, which is 1-inch tall type, "Praise the lard." It's a full-page story. It's less expensive, about the fourth the cost of butter. It is the highest performing of all shortenings. It has the greatest ability to hold air, the greatest ability to hold moisture. If you don't believe it, take a cube of lard and a cube of butter and whip them as long and hard and fast as you can. Your lard will gain half again volume. Butter will just barely up a little. Butter in this country is 20% milk. And because it's 20% milk, and that's why it doesn't make as good a pie crust, because the liquid starts to activate the gluten, and that makes ropey, tough pie crust. So lard is so perfect for baking and all. And you, well, I don't know whether you know this or not, but the people that dirty dogged lard were Procter and Gamble. Right after, and they're known as, well, they used to be known as the world's best marketers. They introduced Tide, the first detergent. They introduced oleomargarine, and so on. Well, they wanted to introduce oleomargarine after World War II, when butter was in such short supply, and the dairy industry lobbied, so they had to have the Nucoa margarine, where you'd have to knead it together to make the color get yellow. But in order to get any market share, they had to dirty dog or make fun of some of their competitors. Well, the most obvious was lard. So if they made lard sound unhealthy, that would make people go for their product. Got it? However, lard has less saturated fat, less calories, and less cholesterol than butter. And the hydrogenated shortening, the hydrogenation process is how they make margarine and Crisco, and the hydrogenated shortenings is a declared carcinogenic process. So there you have it.
So you've convinced me on the pie crust, but I'm not going to put it on my toast, okay?
No, I wouldn't recommend. Although I did have one of my weekend cooking school students even went to Mexico, and she's a close friend. She said, "You know, we were so poor when we were growing up that we had lard sandwiches in central Illinois."
Wow, lard sandwiches. So let me ask you a question about chilies. There are a lot of chilies that are actually grown right here in Corrales. We happen to have some in our front yard. How do they compare to chilies that come from other parts of the state? Like, of course, Hatch is known for chilies, or even other parts of the country.
Well, you know, Hatch, speaking of Procter & Gamble, Hatch is probably the Procter & Gamble of the chili business. I can remember as a kid, it used to, if you blinked twice, you went through Hatch. Most of the chilies that are marked Hatch are not grown there. In fact, Wagner Farms and a lot of the growers up here send their chilies down there, because then it's like putting a postmark on them. At any rate, the difference in chili growing. Chilies grow best in sandy soil without too much water. We used to grow chilies on the Pecos River. Not on the river, but I mean on the acreage nearby. And if people wanted hotter chilies, we turn back on the water. If people want milder chilies, just water them and water them and water them. You can't overdo it, and they'll mildew and won't develop. But chilies here will probably maybe not get quite as big, although that's not necessarily true. You have to just know the right cultural aspects. And there is a chili university down at New Mexico State. And I had the great pleasure of knowing Dr. Jim Nakayama, who the Big Jim Chilies, he developed that. But you can get a lot of information free from New Mexico State on growing chilies.
Chili University. Now that's a degree I hadn't thought about. Tell me about avocados, because the one thing you haven't touched on, I think, is guacamole. And a lot of us love avocados, and we go to the store, but we're never really sure whether it's ripe or not ripe.
Oh, well, I just have some. Let me just go one step.
Okay, you go one step, and then I'll invite anybody else who's got a question.
A restaurant in New York. And the best way to buy avocados is to plan ahead. Now, I bought these Wednesday, and they were hard as rocks. But if you If you ripen them, see, these are now getting just perfect. I can press my thumb. If you ripen them on top of your refrigerator, that's the warmest place and, to ripen them. Once they get to the perfect ripening, you can keep them from 8 weeks in your refrigerator.
Wow.
And the best way to make guacamole is to not use a fork, don't use a blender, don't use a food processor. Cut the avocado into little squares like you're cutting baby food, and then fold the other ingredients in. Try it that way sometime if you haven't. It tastes so fresh and so wonderful, and it will keep up to 5 days. And I've taken leftover guacamole and put it with a vinaigrette, and it makes a fabulous salad dressing. Or you can put it and fold it into an omelet. I mean, leftover guacamole is great on hamburgers. I mean, don't ever let guacamole go to waste. Of course, I hardly ever have any that's left over. So, but if you do, those are some good things to know.
Sure, and avocado toast. We've all started making avocado toast. But you do put,
I'm sorry.
You do put chili in your guacamole, right?
Yeah, I like to use jalapenos because green chilies have a little too much water. Here's how I make guacamole. For 1 avocado, it's approximately 2 to 4 tablespoons, depends on the size of the avocado, of fresh, finely chopped onion. Same amount, 2 to 4 tablespoons of pretty finely chopped red ripe tomato, 1 clove of fresh garlic, and some fresh lime juice and a bit of salt. Like for 1 good sized avocado, you could use sort of a little rounded 1/4 up to a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And then just fold the ingredients together and add cilantro, coarsely chopped if you want. And it's fabulous. And it doesn't take that long to make. And then if you have any left over and you want to keep it really well, put it in the most vertical container you have and press down cellophane wrap so that you get rid of any oxidation or any air, and it'll stay green for up to 5 days.
Great information. I think we have another question, right, Sandy?
We do, and this is one I'm really interested in hearing the answer to. Chris Wentz says, we love tamales, but we have been intimidated by all the stories about how difficult and time-consuming they are to make. Any words of wisdom?
Oh, yes. Well, I grew up in a family where my mother thought to her dying day, tamales are her favorite food. And my brother has dementia, and we had a Zoom 2 weeks ago. And I said, Fred, that's his name, what are you hungry for? What would you like? Tamales, please bring tamales. And so I sent him some tamales. I sent them on Tuesday. They got there on Friday, and they were frozen. Tamales are fun. Of course, I grew up as a little kid. I think by the time of 4, I learned how to tie a tamale. Tamales, there's just a definite, come to my classes. We have tamale roll classes. Tamales are part of the weekend, the week long. Maybe I should just do another kind of tamales class. There are several hints and tips. First, you need good quality masa. It should be coarsely ground. In the old days, and even to this day sometimes, the people that make the best tamales have to have that coarsely ground masa. It's not going to be easily available in your supermarkets. I do have it available. The other way you can make it is to boil up pozole and then grind it. That's a little more time consuming. So anyhow, you get your masa really wet. You can make any kind of filling. My mother's favorite was the red chili beef. I know here they use pork a little. But you can do vegetarian tamales. You can do we make 2 of them on Thursday in our class this coming week. We make the red chili beef, and we're going to make the green corn tamales. And they're made from fresh corn. You take corn off the cob, and you grind that, and you mix it with beaten butter and cream. You put green chili and cheese in the center, and they're to die for. But you can make dessert tamales. We make 3 or 4 kinds of dessert tamales. Tamales are fun. I think if you know the right way to do them, and don't try it by yourself. It's a social event. Try to get at least 2 or 3 other people. One person takes the soaked husk, another person smears on the masa, another one puts the filling, another one ties them, or you can do all 4 steps by yourself. But it doesn't take all that much time and effort. And the beautiful part about it is once you make tamales, don't steam any more than you're going to eat right then. Freeze them hard as a rock right away, like on a cookie sheet, and then put them in a freezer bag. And then you can cook them from frozen for a time and a half. It's an interesting hint. that if something takes 45 minutes to steam, that's what tamales take at room temperature. If you're going to do it from frozen, just add 22 and a half minutes to that, or a little over a minute and 15 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes. But they're fun, and they're fabulous to eat. You just have to make them the right way. If you don't have the right kind of masa, that masa is the 90%, part of the ingredient. They can be greasy.
Yeah, it is. It's true that it is so much fun to do it with a lot of people. Yeah. I have one final question for you, Jane, and that is, is there a dish that you have that's your go-to dish that when you think, gee, I'm hungry tonight and I've got to make something and I want something easy, what is it you turn to?
Oh, that's a hard question. For the easiest things to do are tacos or fajitas. So it'll be one of those. But for entertaining, one of my favorites is pollo bracho. But I have a lot of favorites. I like the moles, and well, I just like to cook.
So that is a drunken chicken dish. Is that what that is?
It's fun. It's in the same place, Southwest. But when I had my restaurant in New York, if we'd make 15 servings, we could have sold 30. I mean, it's always been so popular. And it sounds ridiculous. If you read the ingredients, you'd say, I don't think I'll like this. But you brown the chicken, and it's best to use thighs, I think, or thighs or legs. But you can use a whole chicken, whatever. You brown it, and then you turn the heat off, and you add beer, and you add garlic, and you add raisins, and ham, and cinnamon, and coriander. And you steam it together until it's this wonderful brown sauce. It's just yummy, yummy, yummy. And you serve it over, I like to serve it over cumin rice.
Sounds fabulous. There was a reason that we held this salon in the late afternoon. Now we are all hungry for dinner. I want to thank you, Jane, for all of the things that you've given us, all this information, and remind everybody that if you want to learn more, you can go to janebutelcooking.com. And before we end, I also want to thank our salon committee. Those are my colleagues, Sandra Ben, Pamina Deutsch, Sandy Farley, Barbara Marks, Sue Winstead, and Charlene Spiegel. And speaking of Charlene, we really do appreciate her willingness to sponsor today's salon. So thanks again, Jane Butel, for sharing your extensive knowledge of the culinary history of our area. And thanks to all of you for watching.